Welcome to the Live Inspired podcast with John O'Leary. John is the #1 national best-selling author of the book On Fire. He's a world-class inspirational speaker, and he's the host of the Live Inspired podcast. John interviews extraordinary individuals on their life story so that you can wake up from accidental living and more fully live your life story. Here's your host, John O'Leary.
Well, hello, my friends, and thank you, Joe Buck, for the introduction. For those of you who are tuning in live with us, we are recording this the day before the podcast launches. So we are live on a Wednesday. We are across all social media platforms. And so if you happen to be tuning in right now, I just encourage you to let us know where you are watching from, where you are tuning in from, where you're listening from. Let us know. And then also share this link with your followers, with your friends, because today's episode is going to be one that will deeply inspire their lives. Yeah, it's going to inspire your lives, but it's going to inspire all those in your neighborhood. That's a key word today, in your neighborhood. So my wife, about 11 years ago, told me that she met an amazing man earlier that day. So I said, tell me about him. She said his name was Bill. She did not for sure catch the last name, but she talked about how this man was making his way down our sidewalk. He was clearly unable to see, but he was journeying to the YMCA by himself. Now, listen, I live in Webster Groves, Missouri. There was a YMCA about 3/4 of a mile. I never walked there, and I have the ability to see. This gentleman, Bill, was walking, unable to see, but walking for a workout in the morning. Well, a couple of weeks later, I saw Bill walk by our house. A couple of weeks after that, I saw Bill walk by the house again. And this time I stopped him. I introduced myself and extended my hand, shook his, and began to learn his story. It is this story today, my friends, that will absolutely remind you that in spite of the challenges you faced in the past, that you face right now, or that you might face, you don't even see it coming yet, but you might face going forward, that you are capable of rising above, that your life is worthy, and that the best days remain in front of us. Bill Johnson is the author of a newly released incredible book called Snowblind. I have a copy in front of me today. And I think after you hear this conversation, you also will want to go out and get a copy for yourself. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the author of a new book. Let me introduce you to a man who somehow works out still. Let me introduce you to a neighbor and a man that I look up to. His name is Bill Johnson. Brother Bill, neighbor Bill, welcome to Live Inspired with John O'Leary.
Oh, thank you so much, John. I really appreciate this. It's humbling to be here.
Well, man, I feel the same way. And you were the kind of man who you made me pull a little bit to get the story out of you. You shared kind of in passing some of the things that happened, some of the things that led to your blindness when we first became neighbors and friends. But in your book, you get right after it.
Yeah.
Sometimes in books, it begins with words like, I was an outgoing child, or my parents raised me this way. You begin with the words July 2nd, 1991. Why do you begin with those words?
Well, that's the day when my life changed in a very dramatic way. I appreciate all your introduction, and if I, by being here, if I could inspire somebody to find some strength and hope and courage to go on, as you put so well, everybody's got challenges, big and small. Some are dramatic, some are less dramatic, but mine was pretty dramatic. I was on a business trip in Atlanta, and walking, to the MARTA, to the subway there with a friend, my boss, who was a good friend, and also a client of ours. I worked for KPMG, a big accounting firm, and somebody came up behind us for no reason, and I heard pop, 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 pop. It was July the 2nd, and I thought, who in the heck is shooting firecrackers in downtown Atlanta? And I turned my head, and as I turned my head, I got struck, in the head through the temples by a bullet. What I'd heard was not firecrackers; it was this fellow shooting a gun at us, and the shots I'd heard first were the ones hitting my boss and our client. And then I was fortunate enough to turn my head, and I got it, right through the temples. But I've never really asked the doctor, but I'm of the belief that had I not turned my head, I'd probably have not survived like my two companions did not survive.
And Bill, I'm gonna
Yes,
just
sir.
let you know, only you would use the words, "I was fortunate enough to turn and be shot through my temples."
Wow.
So it's this mindset that you shared a moment ago, that you share throughout the entire book, and that I witness as a man who lives just 3 doors down from you, that amazes and absolutely humbles me. You also shared in the book that you were going to take a cab, that you were running late for this flight, and you're like, "Yeah, we'll just take a cab." And the client said, "No, don't do that. Let's take the MART. I think you'll get there even quicker." And then rather than pointing you in the direction, he walked with you. It was a decision that would cost him, your boss, both of their lives, and you eventually your vision. But in the book, you never really asked the question, why? You never even really asked the question, oh, gosh, what if? What if we just got in the doggone cab? Why don't you play that game? It's one that so many individuals, myself included, play from time to time in their lives.
John, again, I'm going to say I'm fortunate that this was not a violent incident to me, and I think that's probably. It was, of course, the outcome, the impact, the experience I had, but I wasn't assaulted. I didn't see it in front of me. I didn't fight with a person or anything like that, and I guess I believe that because of that, I was able to move on pretty quickly. I think that going back and saying playing what if games just really wouldn't do me any good. I got focused pretty quickly on what I needed to do, which was to recover, physically to a large degree, but and get on with what was going on in my head to accept this and move on. I guess I've just never seen anything to be gained by going back and playing what if. So.
Bill, you were shot on July 2nd. On July 5th is really the first time you come to.
Yeah.
When did you realize the extent of the injuries that you'd experienced?
Well, as I write, when I got shot, I remained conscious for quite a while. And the pain that I felt was about 99% in my eyes, and I don't know why that was, but I know there's a lot of retinal damage, and the optic nerves are pretty beat up and all this. And I remember sitting there on the sidewalk, kneeling with my hands over my eyes, because the sunlight was really the painful thing. So I was blocking my eyes from the sun. And I remember thinking, I don't know. I have no idea what just happened to me. I didn't put two and two together right there by myself. But I do remember thinking that if I lose consciousness, I'm going to die. And so I just focused on staying conscious. Strangely enough, I remembered a bunch of Boy Scout stuff, first aid probably from a merit badge, and I was laying sort of face down, kneeling, and I remember thinking, I don't remember very much first aid, but it seems like there wasn't anything where you laid down face down, so I rolled over on my back. And I don't know that was good, bad, or anything else, but that was kind of what was on my mind. I still didn't know really what had happened.
When you found out what happened, you were no longer by yourself. You were no longer being treated by the EMTs who you wrote about, and the ER who treated you on day one. Eventually, you're going to find that your father is there to take your hand, and your sister Catherine is on the other side.
Right.
Just talk about, because one of the things that unifies us, in addition to our zip code and our proximity physically, is the fact that we spent some time in our lives in darkness. You far more than I, but as a little boy, I spent months in darkness and was very scared the entire time. But having family nearby was incredibly comforting to me when I was going through my recovery. How meaningful was it for you, Bill, to have your dad and your sister around you during those first few days in Atlanta?
Oh, it was very much so. It was just awesome. And, really when I woke up from, I think I was heavily medicated. I had lost consciousness in the CT, but I think they kept me medicated for a couple of days. Yeah, and the first thing I remember really when I woke up, I mean, there was a nurse there who saw me at first, but almost immediately my dad and my sister were right there with me, and able to say the things you would expect. They said, oh, they were, so grateful to see me wake up. They were so, happy. They didn't know if I was ever really going to be able to speak again or do anything again. And nobody mentioned the eyesight, but it was a great comfort. My sister and I had been, as kids, not all that close, but in our, probably 5 or 6, 7 years before this, we had become very, very close. As I was going through a divorce, she kind of reached out to me and, just said if there's anything she could ever do, and she flew down from Chicago to do that. It made a huge difference. So, of course, my dad, yeah.
Bill, and I need to give a shout out to one of our loyal listeners, and now today one of our viewers, Beth O'Leary. A fellow viewer is tuning in from her car outside of Carpool Line today, along with Jeff Gidre and Carol Van Hooser, and rural Texas with Bevlin is tuning in New Jersey. We have friends tuning in from around the United States and around the world, learning about the author of Snowblind. His name is Bill Johnson. This episode is brought to you by our friends from Keeley Companies. Bill, you spent about a week in Atlanta recovering before ultimately you're on an airplane being traveled back to St. Louis. You recover at Barnes over time. And it was there that you begin to learn that the eyesight's not coming back. And in the book, you wrote really emotionally about some of the stories and some of the quotes that others shared with you about that. But it's one of your quotes about the difference between admitting and accepting that I want to share. And then I'm just going to ask you what those words mean to you as you wrote them, as you heard them, and now as you live them. So here's the quote. Admitting that I was blind was simple. After all, I was in the hospital room, could see only blackness, had knocked over several drinks, and when I was finally free of the IV lines, I was still not allowed to get out of bed by myself. But admitting that fact was quite different from accepting what had happened to me. Talk about the difference between admitting that you were going to be blind and fully accepting that fact.
Yeah, I think admitting is, I guess, a little bit more on the surface, as though I really couldn't deny. There was a lot of logic that I could not deny, that I couldn't see in that immediate moment. What happened, and I'm grateful for today in that hospital room, was I had a lot of bluster, and I kind of tried to put up a front like this was no big deal. Let me out of here. I'm going to get back to my life. And, knowing, I guess, somewhere subconsciously that nobody was going to let me out that particular day. But when it was scheduled that I would get out, there was an afternoon where I think I really did accept it. I came to grips with the fact that, this had been kind of an entertaining experience to some degree, with the nurses around and everybody catering to whatever I wanted. But I realized I really couldn't open my eyes, and it was going to be black forever. And I just had to come to grips with that, and that to me was the accepting, and it was an emotional afternoon, and I think it could be described in a couple different ways by a psychologist or somebody that, had more faith in God than I did back then. But one way or another, I was given that gift of acceptance. It took some emotion, it took some anger, and it took all of that we hear about in the 5 stages of grief. But I had to come to grips with it.
Well, you wrote about coming to grips with it, and I have a couple quotes that I pulled from the book. And anytime, Bill, I see Beth reading a book and she gets all the way to the end of it, I know that is an awesome book. And so she was fully invested in your book from page 1 all the way until the very end. This quote jumped off at both of us. It is this: I lay in my bed, and remember, this is while he's still in hospital, still recovering, and grinned. What had come over me to cause such total acceptance and peace? There had been many miracles in the past week, and this overwhelming peace was yet another. It was a miracle that I wasn't killed with my associates, a miracle that Grady Memorial Hospital was a world-renowned trauma hospital. And now, the greatest miracle of all, the gift of acceptance was bestowed on me that afternoon in Barnes Hospital. The gift of acceptance. Yeah. What a miracle. Did you have, you mentioned a moment ago, you did not have a lot of faith back then, you hinted at. Right. Did you have faith leading into the gunshot, and how did this experience change that faith?
I had gone to church when I was young, up until the age of 18. Every Sunday, sang in the choir, did the fellowship, and it really never meant a thing to me, John. As soon as I went off to college and was able to not have my mom taking me to church on Sundays, I didn't engage in church or religion at all, frankly. This really got my attention. I knew at some level that I'm not that good. I was a self-reliant person, but I knew that something special had happened. It didn't really change my, I guess my belief or my faith in a big way immediately, but it certainly was a marker. Since then, as I've gone through life, I have developed a belief in a power greater than myself at this point in my life, and I look back at all the things in the quote that you read, and especially this, the gift of acceptance. And I do know that there is a God, so.
Bill, you wrote about your friends' phone calls while you're in hospital. Yeah. You wrote about a dear friend bringing you White Castles and a couple cold beers. And you also wrote about the first time you got to hear your children's laughter in room. You mentioned earlier you went through a divorce. Through that marriage previously, though, you were blessed with 2 little ones, a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
For me, when I was in hospital, the greatest joy I experienced was actually not the famous people coming by to visit. It was that ritual on Sundays when my siblings would make their way down the hallway, and I would hear the laughter first, and then the children come into my room, and their innocence, I think I found mine. What was it like for you to have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old jump back into your world, even as you were learning how to live within it?
Well, it meant everything to me. At that point, it had probably been 10 or 11, 12 days out, something like that. And I had not spoken to them on the phone at all. So when they, my ex-wife showed up with the 2 kids and, let them come running in the room. And I described my daughter kind of scrambled up on the bed.
Right.
And my son was a little bit more reticent, but, it just meant everything to me that I could hold them and feel them and know that that part of my life was really still there. So.
Bill, with your care, I was amazed at how quickly these mean PTs and these mean OTs got you out of bed, got you getting dressed again, got you moving back into life again, and how quickly they let you not only kind of figure out how to move around the hallways in hospital, but they even took you on a day trip back to your home. Would you just describe what that was like, that first time coming home?
I'll tell you, first of all, I was at Barnes Hospital in St. Louis. I'm very, very familiar with where it is. And they took me down to, I think it was the OT, occupational therapist car to drive over. So they helped me get in the car, and that was all great. And then I remember I could picture driving west, coming out of Barnes Hospital up to Kings Highway, and then turning left, and I could feel the cars, roll me over to the right as we turned left. And I tracked our route through every bump up on Highway 44, off on the exit ramp, and then ultimately up another little bump into my driveway. I was exhilarated, I guess is what I would say. The occupational therapist woman who was with me, she told me to slow down a couple times because, I had no cane, I had no experience blind, and I pictured where things were, but I was not taking any care. If I scrambled up my front steps, had there been things on the stairs, I might have tripped. But I was just exhilarated. I was thrilled. At that point, I had 2.5 weeks, going on 3 weeks of just being anxious to get out and go home.
Mom and Dad thought home might mean your old childhood home. It might mean them taking care of you. You had very different ideas. When you were finally released from Barnes, you went home to your house. You went home to no dogs.
Right.
You went home, not yet knowing how to use a cane, not yet knowing how to make food. I was amazed, man, to think about your mother and father hugging you goodbye, pulling the door shut, getting back in their car, driving home, knowing that their son was in this house by himself in total darkness. Talk about it from your perspective. How did you feel that night when you were at home by yourself?
I was lonely and I was scared. As I said before, I had a little bit of bluster in the hospital where I was just saying, "Let me out of here," and hopefully in a nice way. But I was intent on getting out, going home, going back to work, dropping back into my family's life, dropping back into my friend's life without really much thought to the details of any of that. So when when my parents left pretty reluctantly and the front door closed and there I was by myself, it was like, okay, Bill, this is what you've been yammering for here. What are we going to do? And as I wrote, I started going around the room in a kind of a behavior that it served me pretty well, to go around and feel the various end table and the television and what's on top. And it's, pictures of my kids, and I knocked it over. But it really gave me a feeling of what was in the room. It reminded me what my living room looked like. And gave me some comfort that I was there. But it was scary, no doubt.
Bill,
John, and I'll say the more as I went through other rooms, I started to stumble across other things that, I just couldn't do. I couldn't differentiate whether it was a drawer with a bunch of bills in it, or ultimately in the kitchen, realizing that a can of beans looked like a can of green beans looked just like a can of pork and beans to me, as I say, look as I feel it. Or the box of Cheerios versus Wheat Thins, but at least I could open them up and feel which one was which. So I started to first come and, I think it's first started to sink into me that there was a lot I couldn't do.
And I would almost do like ... yet. It was almost as if every challenge that you encountered, whether it was bills or frying bacon or getting dressed or whatever the thing is, whatever the opportunity was, you never viewed it as the end of the line. You viewed all of it as just, I will do this. I just can't do it yet. And one of the big steps that you're going to take back toward the new normal is when you hop on a flight and you make your way down to Little Rock, Arkansas.
Yeah.
Would you talk about why Lions World? What is that? What were you hoping to get out of it?
Yeah, in the hospital, my sister had started this, doing some research into where I might go to get what would essentially be occupational therapy, assuming I could and would get the opportunity to go back to my old job. But someone from St. Louis Society for the Blind visited me in the hospital and checked, looked at the situation. I guess the social worker from Barnes, to start at the beginning, didn't exactly know what to do with me, but knew that it required some skills and expertise beyond what they normally encounter in the hospital. So it was St. Louis Society for the Blind, and she referred me to the state of Missouri Department of Rehab Services for the Blind. And so that's the answer to your question, is there was a contract between the state of Missouri and this school in Arkansas named Lions World School for the Blind that is supported by Lions clubs all over the country. And what I needed to learn was, I didn't know, but what ended up being important to me was the orientation and mobility, which is walking around with a cane safely and knowing where I was. So it turns out about that time, computerized voices were being put onto laptops, and it made accessible some simple DOS programs like WordPerfect in particular. I didn't know any of this at the time, but I was exposed to it down there. That was one of the key things they had to teach me. I guess like anybody who's newly blind, I would have thought, boy, I've heard of Braille. I guess maybe Braille is something I need to learn. So I was taught Braille. They also ran me through a lot of other classes as though I was starting from scratch, but just, I guess, to be able to check off the boxes, especially for the state of Missouri. And it had to do with things as simple as being able to sign my name in a repeatable fashion, being able to use a calculator that had been outfitted with a voice, and they called that class mathematics, I think, or arithmetic, and they probably should have called it calculator, but how to dress, how to grooming. I mean, some kind of basic things. And in many of those cases, I was really grateful that I had gotten to the age of 41 and I had, an education, a profession. I'd learned a lot of those skills. There was actually people going to Lions World who needed to learn those things.
So I'm going to encourage our studio audience, those who are tuning in from around the nation and around the world, if they have any questions. You are listening to Bill Johnson. He is the author of Snowblind. He is a phenomenal human being. He's also my neighbor and my friend. We're going to be taking a few of the folks who are commenting today and sending you, this is the courtesy Live Inspired, we're going to be sending you signed copies of Bill's book. So you want to let us know where you're tuning in from, what inspires you most about Bill, or maybe a question that you have for him. So anything you chat in, it's going to increase the likelihood of you having an opportunity to get your very own, and you will want it. It's called Snowblind. It's a beautiful book. We'll talk more about that title here in a moment, Bill. Mm-hmm. For graduation from Lions World, they eventually take a man who dressed himself that morning and prepared himself for the day that morning and got himself downstairs to eat breakfast that morning and fed himself that morning. Well, eventually they put you into a car. They take you into Little Rock. They drop you off at the quarter and they wish you well. To pass the test, you got to figure out how to get back to the school. It's an amazing story. But for my friends who are listening to my voice right now or watching our program right now, just imagine being dropped off at a street corner, far away from where your home is, and now your eyes are shut and you've got to figure out how to navigate this. This was Bill's life. It remains his life. He passes the test. He gets back to the school. He eventually gets back on a plane, back to St. Louis, back to his kids. And yet it's still not an easy life. Bill, I told you there were a couple of quotes that really moved me. Here comes another one. You wrote, "Hey, once again, I felt all alone." This is now you in St. Louis back at your home. Yeah. "Once again, I felt all alone in a strange place. I was blind in the world I used to see and know. The scripted part of my journey was over. Now I had to start walking the walk. I had to start dealing with the world as an independent person, not just on weekend visits home, when much of the weekend was filled with my family, friends, my children, increasingly Virginia." We'll get back to that. "But I had to do it every single day. No one was going to knock on my door and tell me what to do next. The next move was up to me." When you hear that quote shared through my voice, but your words, talk about it. Talk about what that means, not only to you, but to us.
Well, You know, it really was true that the 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it was between when I got out of the hospital and when I went to Lions World, um, I had there was a lot of folks around, whether it was neighbors, friends, my parents, my sister was still in town, and I really wasn't. Um, I knew what I was going to do. I had something to work on. I was getting, dealing with the state of Missouri as it turned out. So when I got back from Lions World after Thanksgiving, I was just struck with the fact there wasn't any script that, now I needed to, go on with my life. And I had been saying all along, this is what I wanted to do. So here I was, struck with it. One of the things I say in there somewhere, John, is that, as these various things that I couldn't do, whether they were little, simple tasks in my life or, bigger things in my life, I always kind of looked at them just naturally somehow. I looked at them all as being a puzzle that I needed to solve. And I think that served me very well. I got a kick out of when I then was able to learn to do things. Um, so, yeah, sitting there at home with by myself with nothing to do, nowhere to go on a Monday or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Um, I knew that there were some big things that I had been saying I wanted to do in the future, which were going back to work, primarily.
Right. Going back to work, raising two children,
Right.
living a life, walking around the neighborhood, returning to the man that you knew you could become. And
Yeah.
Bill, you wrote about it beautifully. You almost gamified everything. You became like a child again,
Yeah.
rather than feeling anxiety around falling, if you will, knowing that that's part of growing. And so I just deeply moved. And for you, there were some massive blessings that grew out of this tragedy. One of them was a chance encounter with a nurse from neurosurgery. Her name was Virginia. She came into your room a couple times while you were at Barnes. She was your contact person afterwards on the phone, but she was much more than that as things progressed forward. So I'm gonna let you talk a little bit about who Virginia is and what became.
Yeah. So Virginia was she was a nurse, I don't coordinator, I think was her title, with the Department of Neurosurgery, and came by the hospital room. I think it was probably the first morning that I woke up there and knocked on the door, and she was kind of doing rounds similar to a resident. So she, there was a knock on the door, and I had by then learned to say, "Who is it?" whenever there was a knock, and she said, "Well, my name is Virginia," and I said, "Oh, Virginia, is it true there really is a Santa Claus?" And that line came to me out of some old movie, and I don't know how that happened, but that's what I said, and she said, "Well, there is if you believe." And so then she came in and introduced herself and asked me how I was doing, and she was really the very first kind of a human person. I mean, the doctors were nice and they were engaging, but they didn't. Anyway, Virginia's listened to me some and answered some questions, and I asked her some questions, about what was in store for me or whether I would see again that, maybe sometimes some of the doctors, were a little bit more evasive about. But yeah, one way or another, before I got out of Barnes, she had really become a confidant. And then, yeah, as you say, John, she was the representative back in the Department of Neurosurgery. Because when I left the hospital, I had some medications I was still on. I had not terribly open, but still had some wounds on my head where there had been a craniotomy, it's called, that opened up my skull at one point. And so that I was still under the care of the doctors, and she was my contact. Yeah.
Well, she was your contact. She was also going to be a dinner date here shortly. You picked up the phone with the excuse of talking medicine, but I think you were really thinking far more than that. What was it about this woman named Virginia that you began to think to yourself, And, maybe it's more than her just answering questions or taking out stitches or whatever else she was doing for you medically. Maybe there's a relationship here, and maybe it's even an intimate relationship down the road. What was it about Jenny that you saw that potential? What were you attracted to first?
She was just a very, pleasant, charming, funny, witty person. She would listen to what I had to say, and always in an upbeat mood, always in a good mood, and we just seemed to get along. We just seemed to hit it off. She, I don't know how to describe it, I guess, John, but she, there was something beyond the professional relationship with the doctors and with the other nurses and a lot of people down there that somehow we just connected.
Well, I'm glad you did, because now she's my neighbor as well. And as lovely as you are, Bill, I call her Jenny. You refer to her in the book as Virginia until she tells you halfway through, by the way, my friends call me Jenny.
Yeah.
So that's when you stop referring to her by the professional name and refer to her, the one that Beth and I know her as, Miss Jenny. Right. An amazing lady. By the way, while you're speaking about her and your love, we're showing pictures of some of the travels that you've taken together. It strikes me, traveling is challenging for all of us. It's particularly challenging when you can't see necessarily what the next step might look like. You can't, obviously, Bill, and yet you unapologetically travel around not only your own backyard, your own neighborhood, but you travel around the world with Jenny. What is it about traveling that you enjoy so much?
Well, as I went back to work, traveling between my home and the airport, and then between cities or even countries, and then from another airport to a hotel, is really kind of the easiest, especially when I'm on my own, because that whole part of travel industry, so to speak, between taxi cabs and assistance at the airport, is really set up for me. And it makes it very easy. When Ginny and I travel, of course, we just kind of go as tourists together and go through the security together and all that kind of stuff. So it's two different answers there. What I like about so we did go last year. We were married 25 years, 2 years actually, 2 years ago, before COVID. And we decided to go on a cruise, and some of those pictures, I'm sure, are from Spain and Portugal and Morocco. We would get whatever city or country we were in, we would always get a tour guide. And I just love a good tour guide who can tell a story of, the history of the country. And that's typically what they tell you. More than, look at this beautiful, this or that cathedral in Spain. And we get to know somebody from the tour guide who's a local usually, and I like that, and I like the history. In Morocco, the guy who was our tour guide was a really nice guy and gave us a lot of background about how they ended up with 3 different religions living all together in Morocco. Which I found fascinating. So it's the history part.
So Bill, while you're speaking, we're getting a ton of comments online. One of them from a friend of mine named Jamie Seitz. Jamie Seitz says, Bill, my dad and Pat just gave me your book. I'm 50 pages in. I love it. Best to you and Jenny. So Jamie's loving the book. And then there's a comment from a woman named Carol. Carol summed up exactly how I felt every time you and I talk, but in particular, how I felt when I read your book now twice. Carol said this: it's amazing how calm he seems through it all. I feel I would be devastated, and I just feel so sorry for myself indefinitely. Bill, thank you for sharing your strength, muscle sign, and you inspire me. God bless you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Bill, I mentioned that there were many blessings that grew out of this profound challenge and tragedy, not only for you, but also for your family. Your sister, Catherine, was a successful lawyer working in Chicago in the early 90s and single, never had a child. And then she got a phone call that would change her life when her brother was shot temple through temple. She hopped on the next flight out of O'Hare, made her way down to Atlanta, and was at your bedside, where she also had a chance encounter with a gentleman. named Rich. Talk about Rich and Catherine, and maybe even like one of the gifts that grew out of their marriage.
Yeah, they they met shortly, maybe even before I had waked up from my part of the experience. And Rich was a fellow that worked at the same company I did. Um, he and he well, he was there to help kind of make sure our families were well taken care of and get the bills paid, and do what needed to be done to try to make the best of this bad situation. And I think the way my sister tells it is that he and she were involved in getting a lot of bills paid and doing some business sorts of things. He was a contact with our company, and when he traveled on business, they got together up in Chicago and went out to dinner. And I think around September, and something clicked there too, and they ended up getting married before the end of the year, in fact. So they, they then it took a few years, but they were then blessed with a couple of kids that were born that might not be wouldn't be on this planet had it not been for what happened to me. So.
Bill, you don't write much about it. Instead, you just live it. And you and I talked right before we hit record and started streaming live, this concept of forgiveness. You had what many people might say was a raw deal. You were just making your way from an office meeting in Atlanta, trying to get to a flight back home to your family, and someone came up and ambushed your partner, ambushed your client, and ambushed you. And yet it seems miraculously, I think, that you don't have bitterness toward this person. Could you just talk about that? Because many of us have a tough time letting go when someone cuts us off while we're driving. Many of us have a tough time letting go of what she said this morning or what he said this afternoon, or an email that someone else sent critiquing our work. You had someone take away two dear things to you and your eyesight, and yet it doesn't seem like you have much bitterness toward that person.
Yeah, John, I will say that when I used to drive, I can remember some times when I got cut off, and I'm human like everybody else, and I can get angry. As I said before, there wasn't any, immediate trauma, or I wasn't confronted with a crime. I didn't see the fellow that did this. And in many ways, I'm just very grateful for that. I think I guess my explanation is that because of that, I really never personalized it. I don't have a vision in my head of what he looked like, or what his posture was, or what I thought before he fired, or I don't have any of that I think would have made my experience somewhat different. So initially, I wasn't. I guess I was just detached from what the actual event was, and that somebody was to blame for this. I think through the years, my approach has been more that there's just really nothing in it for me to blame it on that guy. To get upset with him, to give him a piece of my consciousness or a piece of my mind, or let him live in my head. I just can't let him do that. So I've never let that happen. And he's in prison, and I presume he's going to be there for a long time. And it's just, I'm still just not going to go there. I don't need to give him any thought. He's done enough damage and changed my life enough. There's nothing for me to gain by dwelling on him.
Bill, we're receiving questions from your now friends who are tuning in online with us live today.
Okay.
Named Carol. Carol, you have now, I think anytime someone asks 2 or 3 questions, you definitely get a book sent to you, Carol. So we will direct message you. We're going to get your address, and I'll have Bill sign a copy, and I will personally mail it down to you. But the question is, Bill, were you always this laid back? Did this injury change you and kind of help you focus on the things you can control, let go of the things you can't? or was that just your personality even before you were attacked?
Wow, good question. Certainly, I'll take out of your question the part about, did I get more focused? And I certainly did get more focused on my life, and what was important for me to do, and maybe in some ways what was not important for me to do. I was always reasonably laid back, but I just like all of us, I had anxieties and worries about things that, I maybe in hindsight or in retrospect, I'd say were often kind of trivial and not all that important. And, maybe I needed to just kind of make decisions and not procrastinate. And I don't, whatever. But I, I don't know that answers your question, but I'll just reiterate that I really did get focused on my life. Yes. And what I needed to do seriously. And, no kidding myself, and no taking it easy.
Well, there's a little girl who lives up the street from you named Grace. Her last name's O'Leary. I'm not going to play favorites among my own children, but she's at the very top of the list, tied for first at least. She wanted to know, what do you miss most about not being able to see? So from the old days, for those of us with sight, and we just take it for granted, Bill, you've now been without yours for 3 decades. And little Grace wants to know what you miss most about not having sight.
I'll tell you the thing that struck me right off the bat was the lack of mobility, that how challenging and complicated and sometimes expensive it was for me just to go to the store. Mm-hmm. If I wanted to go to the grocery store and get a jar of cashews, it was, a fairly involved process with taxi cabs and blah, blah, blah. I also noticed there was some privacy that I lost, whether it was my mom, which didn't bother me reading my mail, or other people that are in my house who I asked to read my mail back in the time when I was single without Jenny. Or, sometimes going through an ATM in a taxi cab and having to tell the cab driver my PIN number and trust him that he wasn't somehow writing it down or stealing my, who knows what. I couldn't think it through. But the actual things that I miss seeing, initially I would have said people's faces and smiles. And at some point in the book, I wrote just kind of the variety of the world around me. I think that kind of fades a little bit. I picture people that I have known and seen as they were the last time I saw them, which might be a little upsetting for my 34-year-old daughter, who the last time I saw her, she was 4 or 5 years old. But, and the people that I've never seen, I've learned that there's no way for me to imagine what somebody actually looks like with, any degree of confidence, but I do. I imagine what John looks like, and I imagine what my wife Jenny looks like. So I get some comfort out of that.
I've seen Jenny. You outkick the coverage. As for me, keep walking. Okay, you're not missing much over here. But Jenny, beautiful. And Beth and I were even talking about you. You're a handsome guy. You haven't lost that, and you haven't lost your peace about life, your humor, which comes out, I think, beautifully in the book, but even more so just in your candor in life. And we have a whole bunch of people commenting on your perspective, on like your personality, including one from my friend Maria. So I'm going to put this up on the screen. Thank you, Amy, for your help. She writes, Bill, others can really learn from you and the way you have handled what happened to you, where I believe most people may not have handled it in the same way. Like Carol mentioned, listening to you and to John and your stories are truly eye-openers. So, Bill, you're helping people see the gift of life that is in front of them if they choose to see it and choose to embrace it. Yeah. I remember the first time I met you after you began to share your story. I asked what happened. I think most people don't mind being asked. And you shared, John, I was shot in Atlanta. And I said, I'm sorry. And you replied so poetically, and you replied similarly in the book. And I'm going to read it word for word. It's the fourth quote that I wrote down. And you said to me, and you said also to the readers of the book, this. You said, "Don't be, I say. I'm the luckiest person you'll run into today. I should have been killed, and I was just blinded. I had no other injuries, and I very quickly accepted that I was blind. I had great support from my family and friends, a job that I could still do, and an employer who let me come back to give it a try. My world is just as big and just as broad as it ever was." Bill, talk about that final sentence in particular. My world is just as big and just as broad as it ever was.
Well, I'd say, first of all, and in answer to that last question, I'd say that, beyond, we talked earlier about, hope and strength and courage and things like that. I try to be grateful, and I, that kind of came to me early on, that I was grateful that I wasn't killed and that I did have my life. I knew I was still, the same guy with the same mind, the same personality, and so much on a daily basis that I find in life that I'm grateful for. That's what really kind of keeps me going. The big broad world, I'll say, a lot of that I'll give my wife credit for. We do whatever we want. We go out to dinner in the nicest restaurants, and over the years, I've worked out a pretty good strategy to not be knocking over wine glasses, for example, and things like that. I'm, really very presentable out in public. And no, my wife and I we go do whatever we want. Like we talked about vacations. We had a house for a number of years at Lake of the Ozarks. The chapter I should have written that I didn't had to do with water skiing for the first time after I was blinded. But, I largely do everything I used to do before. I recognize very much that I have a little bit of extra assistance at some aspects of many, many things. I've learned to not be so proud that I can't ask for a little bit of help, and to thank people when they help me. And I just, I find that life's pretty easy if I can do that, to ask for help and be thankful and be grateful for everything I've got.
You may not have written about water skiing. You wrote extensively about snow skiing. And I will insist that our listeners and our viewers just grab a copy of the book Snowblind to learn about how a man who has no vision can crush the slopes of Vail and Aspen and Breckenridge and Keystone. And anything you can ski, Bill can ski better, baby. So Bill is an amazing, accomplished skier. He's a great human being. And yet, Bill, what we know is that there's so many folks out there today who are struggling. They're isolated. They're struggling in a relationship or financially or with an addiction. They're just done. Like many of us just feel like I can barely hold on. And yet you write about how your world is expanding, how it's even bigger, and how blessed you are. What advice would you give as we get ready to pivot into the Live Inspired 7? What advice would you give to someone today whose light is beginning to fade and whose hope is beginning to become farther diminished?
Well, I think in my case, and I can just talk from my own experience, it was accepting. It was being honest with myself and accepting a situation, and then taking ownership of it and making a decision to do what I needed to do, to do my role, do my part of what needed to be done. I said before, I used to procrastinate. I would have a lot of difficulty making decisions. And I learned over the years that making decisions and going forward, I always felt better when I finally made the decision and had a direction and started, working for changing whatever it was, fixed, doing it, taking some actions to make it better. And resolve it, whatever the right verb might be. So I guess my advice is to get on with it. And I think you'll find that, once you have a direction and made a commitment, that you'll have some hope and find the courage to do what needs to be done.
Bill, people are thanking you for having the courage to not only do what needed to be done, but to show everybody else what could be done in their lives. We have 7 questions that tether all of our remarkable guests, whether they are leaders or authors or astronauts or overcomers or mountain climbers, or today neighbors, who are all of the things I mentioned a moment ago, including a phenomenal author. But Bill, the first question for you is, what is the best book you have ever read? So looking back, whether it's recent or back from your childhood, what's one of the most influential books you've ever read?
I believe it's called Pillars of the Earth. It's a oh boy, I can't think of the author. It's the first of a trilogy. It's I'll come up with the author's name, but it's just awesome.
Pillars of the Earth.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I'm sure we'll have some wonderful follower who will Google it for us and give us the answer. Pillars of the Earth. It's Bill's choice. Bill, what is one positive characteristic or one trait that you possessed as a child that you wish you exhibited as brilliantly today?
I would say curiosity and willingness to learn. I was curious about things, mechanical and things, academic to a degree. I liked learning. I didn't really like the structure of school and teachers and that environment so much, but I always did like learning, and I was always curious to know more.
Bill, if your house happened to be on fire and Jenny and the dogs and the animals are all outside safe, so everybody's outside, everything is okay, but you have an opportunity to go back into that home and save one item, what would be the one thing that you would come running back outside with?
I have a device called a Victor Reader Stream, which is a digital book reader on which there's probably 100 books that I intend to read. That may sound kind of self-serving, but that's what jumps out at me. Some of the adaptive devices in my life are pretty huge.
Yes.
And, yeah.
So, by the way, Pillars of the Earth is written by a gentleman named Ken Follett.
That's it, Ken Follett.
Ken Follett,
yeah,
the author. So thank you, community, for sharing that with us. And by the way, that didn't seem selfish at all for you to go in and grab that reader. To me, it makes an awful lot of sense. If you could sit on a bench on a gorgeous day and have a long conversation with anybody, living or deceased, who would you like to be seated next to?
The first name that comes to mind is my first thing that comes to mind is my boss, Tony.
Wow.
Who was killed. And I write in the book that he was a much, much brighter individual than me, with an advanced degree from MIT in computer science or engineering or whatever it was back in the 80s. And just a fascinating guy and a very, very good friend. I would love to talk with him. He had an intellect that could always challenge me to do more and always keep me interested.
What's the first thing you would say to Tony? So maybe something that went unsaid or something you'd like to say after what happened.
I'd like to just tell him he in the book, I say it's an old Tony La Russa saying, but I say he was tied for first as the best boss I ever had in my life. I just would like to thank him. He had hired me away from another firm. We were in a similar segment of the consulting technology field, and I'd just love to thank him for the opportunity that he gave me and the trust he showed in me.
Well, one of your friends, Mary Lee Mulvaney, I believe, is thanking you for your love and for your example. So, Mary Lee, we're glad you are part of this, and I'm glad that I was able to share that with Bill. Bill, we're down, my friend, to only 3 questions left from the Live Inspired 7.
Okay.
as we tick down toward the hour together. What's the best advice you've ever received?
Wow. I guess just the first thing that comes to my mind is, even when I was an adolescent, my parents used to tell me to not worry about what other people thought about me. And as I guess the older I get, the more I maybe learn to see the wisdom of that if I'm making decisions and doing things to impact in a positive manner what somebody else thinks about me, that's not a very good motivation. I need to do what's in my heart and what I want to do and what's going to fulfill me.
Great advice for all of us. And what advice would you give your 20-year-old self? If you could go back 21 years before that shooting and whisper some encouragement or some advice into yourself at age 20, what would you say to yourself?
Go to class. I was at University of Kansas, and I was a really unengaged student. Now, what I would I would ask myself to get challenged with getting an education, and challenge myself to, get the best education in the best field that interested me the most. I've said to a number of friends, I came by being basically a network and telecom engineer by growing up in that field. Had I been more serious when I was in college, I'm confident I would have ended up in the School of Engineering. So,
I think you've learned far more from the classroom of life than you would have learned in whatever school you went for engineering. But I hear you loud and clear. And I think it leads perfectly into our seventh Live Inspired and our final question for Bill Johnson. It is this. It has been said that all great people, Bill, can have their lives summed up in one sentence. Bill Johnson, neighbor, friend, author, and overcomer, and skier, and snow skier, and parent, among other job titles. How would you like your one sentence to read?
I would like it to read that I gave life 100%.
Bill Johnson did indeed give life 100%. He is the author of a book titled Snow Blind. It's available at various bookstores around the country and around the world, including Amazon online. Bill, there's also a couple local retailers that I think have physical copies. Would you talk about that?
Yeah, there's one of them is called The Webster Groves Bookshop on North Gore. That is a kind of a successor business to one with the same name that was in a different location that specializes, and I think they still do, in children's books. And I used to shop there for books for my kids back, when I could see and when I was reading books to them at very early ages. The other one that I've heard has the book is called I don't even remember the name of it. It's on Big Bend, also here in Webster Groves.
Novel Neighbor.
The Novel Neighbor. That's exactly it. Yep.
And we will be picking a few lucky winners from those comments who will receive a signed copy. Bill Johnson, I'm holding you to it, from him to you, thanking you for your active participation today and for leaving the message tomorrow. Bill Johnson, I want to thank you for joining us today on the Live Inspired podcast. I want to thank Amy Ouellette, our producer, who does not only all the audio, but also the video for this program. I want to thank Rusty Keeley and the Keeley Companies for sponsoring the Live Inspired podcast. And most importantly, I want to thank you, our listeners, for being part of our movement, part of our community, and part of our belief that in spite of the headwind and the challenges and the disabilities we all face internally and externally, that the foundation remains firm and that even better days remain ahead. So my friends, for this time and until next time, that is Bill Johnson. My name is John O'Leary. Today's your day. Live inspired.